after her PhD, has focused on a number of projects, including the Ways Goose Press, but in particular, the Graphic Investigation Workshop.
I'm a PDF. Yeah. But you have to do, don't you have to do the up and, don't you have to go up to the, down the right-hand corner?
Yep, we're
That's
getting
it.
there.
That one, up. That's it.
Right.
Bottom. That's it. Ooh, hang on, where are we? How do I get back? There we go. Hi. Okay, can everyone hear me? Great. Well, hello all. As many of you know, I've talked about and published papers on the Canberra School of Arts Graphic Investigation Workshop, or GIW as I'll call it today, a number of times, including the 2019 Abbey Conference. And I'm talking about it again today because I've just completed a National Library Fellowship focused on the early years of the workshop. So you're getting a double helping in this session because Paul Ullman will be referencing the workshop in his talk. Fun fact, he was one of the earliest GIW students and the first to join it straight from school. Everyone else in its initial year or so being mature age students, which I find really interesting. And I was one of the last students to go through the workshop 20 years later as a mature age student. So the Canberra School of Art had a fundamental overhaul in the late 1970s to produce a contemporary art school based on Bauhaus principles at the instigator of the first director, German printmaker Udo Sellbach. Sellbach had previously taught printmaking in the South Australian School of Art and then at RMIT, and while in Melbourne helped to found the Print Council of Australia. He established the GIW in 1978 as a course of fine art based on drawing and the use of paper, and hired Czech artist Peter Herrell, who was living in Melbourne at the time with his Australian wife Dorothy, to be the first GIW head of workshop. Apart from a few periods of leave over the decades, Herrell remained the overarching and eponymous head of workshop until it was disbanded in 1998. And his use of diverse staff was the secret to this eclectic workshop and its focus on books. Oh, do I just... Oh, sorry. Which one? Oh, the pointer? Ah, sorry, got it. Sorry. Should know this, I got a briefing in it yesterday. Herrell himself produced art de livre books in the French tradition, unbound, small editions using etching and drawing. Because of this GIW appointment, he attracted the attention of the National Library of Australia and they started collecting his books. In 1984, the Canberra Craft Bookbinders organised a national conference at the Canberra School of Art in conjunction with the National Library of Australia's hosting of a Craft Council travelling exhibition of fine craft bookbindings. Peter and his staff organised a small exhibition of experimental student and staff artist books to show the conference attendees the sort of work that they'd been making, and the catalogue was on my first slide. The actual conference reception to this quite radical display was very mixed, from shock, confusion and anger through to excitement. The little exhibition was ignored in the conference proceedings, and that small catalogue of photocopied pages and a handmade paper cover is the only proof of the event outside of participant memories and one single magazine article printed years later. According to this National Library press release, up here, which I found in the ANU's GIW collection, Herrell soon after donated a selection of student artist books works to the library. The press release became the keystone of my fellowship research. The library, National Library, hasn't got a copy of this document in their own archives, and the books listed were never labelled as artist books because that catalogue term hadn't existed at that time. So they are now, after my residency, hopefully being recatalogued, which was one of my outgoing recommendations. Because of time constraints, I don't want to talk about those particular books here. Some of you might have already watched my, how do I get back? Oh no. Sorry, I've mixed myself up a bit here. My fellowship presentation, which is readily available on YouTube. And this is my old version, sorry. My fellowship presentation is readily available on YouTube, and that discusses them in detail. What I want to touch upon today is the fact that over the 20 years of the workshop, it engaged with the full spectrum of artist book styles, from what is sometimes disparaged as women's crafty books, which use handmade paper, handwriting and textile techniques, to the finer printmakerly books made in limited editions and often involving letterpress, and right through to the minimalist and design-based conceptual books that were birthed in the 1960s and seem to have emerged triumphant in terms of collectability thanks to digital culture. But especially today, I want to talk about its use of handmade paper. Herrell's strengths was that he was open to experimentation and collaboration. His workshop staff ranged from skilled printmaking and drawing instructors through to paper makers and letterpress printers. Everything became fair game. True to the Bauhaus aspirations of the school, all the workshops used visiting artists, national and international, as temporary instructors, as an essential part of the curriculum. So the output of the GIW was deeply experimental and widely varied in genre, scale, and sometimes quality, but always original, pulling upon classical and contemporary literature, film, music, and art. Now, so this is the early version. So this is the YouTube that's up online, and I'm just going to go back to this because this is what I'm talking about now. Okay. So artist books in Australia have always had a strong stream of what I just really cheekily called women's crafty books, particularly from regional areas. And I've mentioned often that in 1983, 24 Australian paper makers attended a major international papermaking conference in Kyoto, Japan, where they encountered some tactile and sculptural artist books and took this inspiration back to their own regions. Papermaking was a burgeoning craft, and this being pre-internet, there were multiple hard copy magazines that covered craft activities. Textiles Fibre Forum, in particular, covered papermaking and artist books in a column called The Paper Chase, written by Catherine Nix, whose son Jonathan was a GIW student, and Penny Carey-Wells, who practised and taught papermaking and artist books in Tasmania. On the left of this slide, Nix is relating her efforts to set up a dedicated papermaking studio at the Canberra School of Art, because papermaking has been fostered within the GIW. She was successful in her efforts, and the paper studio was active for over a decade until dismantled in the 2000s. On the right is that one article I mentioned earlier that mentions the 1984 GIW exhibition 12 years after the event, and called it very exciting, especially Russell Way's Anemone, which you can see in the top left of the article and is actually pictured on my bio in your notes as my sort of image. You can see the anemone version of the book. Carey-Wells reported over the years not only on Australian artist book activity, but international artist books as well, something that, of course, international journals did not reciprocate for many years. One of the reasons why papermaking took hold in the workshop is because of this woman, Gaynor Cardew. Cardew had a papermaking studio outside of the school in the old Canberra brickworks, and she also taught drawing within the workshop. She was passionate about papermaking and very grassroots in her world outlook. In an early 1980s guide to craft practice published by Craft ACT, Cardew recommended rolling your car wheel onto the wet paper stack to press out the liquid. GIW students would be sent to her studio to make their paper pulp, and back at the workshop she encouraged them to be wildly experimental. She would have been the instigator for most of those student works in the 1984 exhibition. Cardew and Herrell, along with masterbinder Helen Waddlington, also made an experimental bookwork for the associated, that fine binding exhibition that I told you about, that deeply shocked some of the senior librarians. And the story of that is in my fellowship presentation. Many of you might be more familiar with the Cardew work included in the National Gallery's iconic 2008 publication of the Australian artist books. There are 20 artists featured in this book, with 5 of them attached to the GIW and 2 more from the Canberra School of Art itself, which is an excellent representation and can be explained by the fact that the author, Alex Selenich, had spent a few sessions with the GIW as a visiting artist, and while doing his 6-week residency at the National Gallery, had stayed with Peter Harrell and his wife Dorothy, thanking him in his acknowledgement section for their introduction to the beauty of daily life in Canberra. He also thanks Robert Heather for being able to speak about this project at the second Artspace Mackay conference in 2005. You'll notice that both Selenich and I captioned Gay Nakaju as a papermaker and cartoonist. She had a wicked sense of humour and a very active cartooning career through her life, publishing hilarious drawings in the Canberra Times, community and government publications, and had regular gigs in Textiles Fibre Forum, Matilda, and the Cane Toad Times. I looked at the Matilda cartoon archive in the National Library, and while all the other cartoonists used neat squares of Bristol board, her work was usually found on the back of a torn-off piece of used printmaking paper. In this work, Requiem to an Epidermis, Kaju is essentially drawing with paper pulp. Her cartoons, drawn in ink, all have that distinct wobbly line that echoes these pulpy edges. And Kaju moved away from Canberra in 1989 and died much too young in 1999. Christopher Croft, whose 1983 sketch of book graces the cover of Selenich's book, was a GIW lecturer who spent a year as head of workshop when Harrell went back to Melbourne to work on other projects. A mixed media artist who operates under the business name of Croftology, he now lives in Germany. He was of interest to me during my fellowship because he was caught up in the quandary that many book artists faced when the ISBN system was introduced, and some of you might have been caught up in this too. It was absolutely mandatory for the first few years for anyone who used an ISBN to give a copy of the book to the National Library. And Croft had put an ISBN on a very deluxe fine press artist book. He had 2 versions of the book, one with colour and one without, so he gave the single colour book to Legal Deposit, and happily the Rare Books team purchased a copy of the colour edition. This book though, the one at the bottom, made 6 years before that, uses a long concertina of handmade paper, most probably made by Gay Nakaju. The description given by Selenich is wonderfully poetic, comparing it to a 19th century library book in one line and ending by describing the closing ritual with cage and box as manifesting the book as a cage or prison. Now this is the level at which the GIW staff and many of the students operated on. They were continually encouraged to play with the book as object and concept, this is in the very early 80s, but also to play with the materials of the book in their own right. Paper pulp became a rich sculptural playground, thread and cloth could be manipulated architecturally, and text was allowed to play with images. In the final years of the GIW, with Diane Fogwell's energy pushing things along, a catalogue raisonné began to develop, eventually published in 3 volumes, and the GIW archive of staff and student work became a travelling exhibition with 3 stops. The Musée des Beaux-Arts de la Ville du Locle in Switzerland, the Australian Embassy in Washington, and finally in 1996 to the National Library of Australia. It was a stunning exhibition, thank you. I was in my 2nd year of art school doing a GIW major, and walking through the exhibition was an incredible experience that has always stayed with me. When I was digging through the holdings of the National Library last year, I saw many wonderful GIW adjacent works, especially made by Harrell, and the highlight of his was an amazing book called Phantom Skin, an unbound art de livre made with his longtime collaborator, letterpress printer Terry Bouchard. It was a colour etching printed on translucent calf gut, wrapped around a long concertinaed page. But I didn't see many student works in the collection, as many as I'd expected to, apart from those by Paul Ullman, because, as he might tell you soon, he developed a healthy economic relationship with the National Library, as did I many years later. I've come to a couple of conclusions about the GIW and the NLA, neither of them absolutely provable because time takes away the people you want to discuss things with. I think that Harrell's initial donation of artist books to the National Library was a test. It was a provocation. The more time I spent researching that initial press release, the more complex the story got. Not all the books were donated at once. Some had been in the library for a couple of years. Some more were sold to the library a few years after that announcement, but they were placed in pictorial rather than in rare books because they looked like print folios. Few of them were easy to find in the catalogue, and often their entries had errors. They were aberrant objects, tricky to comprehend at this particular time in history. I think this made Peter decide that if students wanted work to be in the National Library, they had to sell things for themselves. Instead, he encouraged his students to leave copies of their work to the workshop itself, and they often did, even donating unique works. Over time, the collection grew to 250 works, many of them group projects, and Peter wanted to ensure that the collection would be safe, appreciated and useful. So when the GIW was disbanded in 1998, the archive was transferred to the ANU's Menzies Library Rare Book collection. And I used to take my book and text students over to the collection every semester when I was teaching, and it never failed to change their work for the better. Peter Harrell wrote in 1992 in the first volume of the catalogue Raisonné, and I've paraphrased a little bit, in 1980, when the first completed artist book lay in front of us, it was also the beginning of a dream. Our wish was to provide, in the space of an artist book, a common ground so that the printmakers, the painters, the sculptors and the poets might come together and collaborate while at the same time seeking their own interior voice. The intention is staging a new battle with the conventions. These books are not the result of any book making. They are organic structures arising from different art forms, and their bodies are as various as the students' individual talents. So I'm going to continue researching and writing about the Graphic Investigation Workshop for a while yet. It had everything: art, craft, philosophies, grassroots ideas, high-end production, serious exploration, and a whole lot of playful whack. I'm interviewing students and staff while they're still around, and I have plans to write a book down the track. And it's interesting, only a small proportion of the GIW alumni are full-time practicing artists, and even fewer of them make books these days, but whatever they are doing has been influenced by the collaborative practice they encountered via the making of artist books. Thank you.
Thank you, Caren. And I'm very keen to hear, or read, I should say, further about the Graphic Investigation Workshop down the track. So that brings us to Paul Ullman. And Paul, as you know, completed his, well, you didn't complete your PhD at the Graphic Investigation Workshop, did you? But he started at the Graphic Investigation Workshop and has been outstanding since. I know Paul's work under the name Trembling Hands, and many trembling hands have made many works under Paul. Oh, I should mention, if I'm correct, Paul is the first PhD in artist books in Australia. Because we have to go over here. Okay. Exit. You're watching me.